St. Michael's ICU in Raleigh hums with fluorescent lights casting blue shadows across linoleum floors that smell of industrial antiseptic and floor wax layered over 17 years of institutional cleaning. Megan O'Brien inventories medication carts at 0600 hours, her movements economical and deliberate, her presence nearly invisible as residents brush past without acknowledgement. She wears standard navy scrubs, the fabric soft from 100 washings, her ID badge clipped precisely to her collar at exactly 45 degrees. Inside her jacket lining, sewn with stitches that have held through 3 continents and 2 wars, is a faded unit patch, the same patch her son James wears with his deployment unit to the Hindu Kush. The colors have bleached from desert sun and rain, but the insignia remains clear. She knows exactly where it is without looking. Her station is positioned with clear sightlines to Room 4, where Captain Rodriguez lies connected to ventilators and chest tubes, recovering from 9 bullet wounds sustained in a firefight outside Kabul 12 days ago. She notes his vitals every 30 minutes in handwriting that's somehow too precise, too tactical, each number calibrated like coordinates on a firing range. When she reaches across the nurse's station for a chart, her sleeve rides up revealing a network of scars across her forearm, straight lines, deliberate marks, the kind that come from shrapnel and field surgery, not from accidents or mistakes. Dr. Mercer arrives at 0730 for rounds, his expensive shoes clicking against tile in a rhythm that announces him before he appears. His voice carries the particular confidence of someone who has never been contradicted by anyone with institutional power over him, and he moves through the ICU like he owns the breathing space itself. He pauses at Megan's station, glancing down at her medication cart with the expression of a man inspecting substandard work. His badge reads Dr. Harrison Mercer, Chief of Critical Care, the title embossed in letters that catch the fluorescent light. Megan continues working, her hands steady as surgical lasers, her eyes on the 4 medications she's organizing by time and patient. She doesn't look up. Looking up would be acknowledging his presence, and acknowledging his presence would invite interaction, and interaction with Dr. Mercer has always cost something. He stands there for 4 seconds, she counts, then moves toward Room 4 without speaking. The room went dead silent for a moment, only the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze filling the space where words might have gone. At 08:05, Mrs. Chen in Room 3 needs a peripheral started for blood cultures, and her veins are notoriously difficult, 2 prior misses documented in her chart, track marks like railroad lines from years of dialysis access attempts. The resident assigned to her case, Dr. Patel, 2nd year, is studying her arm with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation that doesn't want solving. He's been there for 8 minutes. Mrs. Chen's pain tolerance is high, her grace is higher, but her forearm is already showing bruising from the first 2 attempts. Megan approaches with a 22-gauge angiocath and a tourniquet, her movements carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that medicine can throw. Dr. Patel looks at her uncertainly. She doesn't wait for permission. She's been doing this for 23 years and 4 months, and she's never missed a difficult stick in the last 18 of them. The tourniquet goes on at the correct pressure, not too tight, not too loose, and her fingers find the vein that's been hiding from everyone else. It's there. It's always there if you know how to feel. The needle slides in without hesitation, without trembling, and the flash chamber fills with blood like a small red promise. Before it's secured, the blood culture's drawn, the tourniquet removed in less time than it took Dr. Patel to locate the arm. Mrs. Chen exhales. "Thank you," she whispers. Megan doesn't respond, just documents the procedure in the chart and returns to her station, her hands as steady as they were before, her face unchanged. She's already forgotten it happened. Dr. Mercer is standing at the end of the hallway, having observed the entire interaction. His eyes narrow slightly as he watches Megan move back to her position. He doesn't approach her. He doesn't congratulate her or make note of it in any official capacity. Instead, he walks to the nursing station and begins reviewing the charts with a kind of intensity that suggests he's looking for something specific, something that he's already decided he'll find. His fingers run across the pages with sharp, aggressive movements. The hallway clock ticks, she can hear it from her position, a sound like a heartbeat that's slightly off rhythm. He's searching, but Megan doesn't know what for yet. Not yet. The MacGuffin object beneath her jacket suddenly feels heavier than it did an hour ago, though its weight hasn't changed. The unit patch is still there, sewn into the fabric with the same stitches that held when she was in the field in 2014, when she was extracting wounded operators from hostile territory, when she was navigating by stars and survival instinct. James has the same patch. She knows because she'd sewn it into his jacket herself 6 months before he deployed, her fingers moving with the same precision they'd used to hold pressure on hemorrhage wounds, to place central lines under fire, to keep people breathing when every reason to stop existed and they breathed anyway. The patch means something specific in certain circles. In St. Michael's ICU, it means nothing at all. It's just fabric. It's just thread. It's just her secret hidden inside lining that no one will ever check, no one will ever find, no one will ever ask about. Her employment history would raise questions in most places. 3-year gap from 2009 to 2012. Another gap from 2013 to 2016. 18 months missing from 2017 to 2018. The St. Michael's Human Resources Department had noticed, of course, but the references she'd provided, all military medical personnel using civilian names only, had closed the conversation quickly. Government contract work, her primary reference, had said when HR called. Can't discuss specifics. But she was cleared top secret SCI. She's trustworthy. HR had filed away that information and never asked another question. Trustworthy. That's what they'd written in her employee file. That's what allowed her to work in critical care at one of the region's largest trauma centers without anyone digging deeper into the chronology of her career. The gaps exist for a reason. The gaps are classified. The gaps are why she's here. Dr. Mercer closes the chart and turns to face her. His expression has shifted, hardened into something more focused than mere dismissal. Miss O'Brien, he says, and she hears the subtle insult embedded in the use of her maiden name when everyone else has moved to first names years ago. Your foreplacement on Mrs. Chen was competent. He pauses, and the pause carries weight. Competent, but not exceptional. Let's be clear about the boundaries of nursing practice in this facility. You're an excellent technician. That's your role. You execute orders. You don't innovate. You don't initiate. You follow protocol and you ask questions before you act. His tone is conversational, almost friendly, which makes the words cut deeper. Do we understand each other? Megan looks directly at him for the first time. Her eyes are the color of weathered stone, the kind found in riverbeds after decades of erosion. She holds his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, not a challenge, just an acknowledgement that his words have been received. Then she returns her attention to the medication cart. Yes, doctor, she says quietly. No apology. No explanation. Just a simple statement of fact. He nods, satisfied that his established dominance, and walks back toward the ICU proper. The fluorescent lights continue their humming, patient and relentless. At 10:30, Megan takes her break in the staff lounge, a room that smells of burnt coffee and stale donuts from the hospital auxiliaries fundraiser 3 days ago. She sits in the corner chair, the one that faces the door but is positioned far enough back that she can't be easily seen from the hallway. She doesn't eat the sandwich she brought. She doesn't eat much anymore when Dr. Mercer is in the building. Instead, she removes her jacket and looks at the unit patch sewn into the lining, her fingers tracing the familiar insignia in a motion so practiced it's nearly involuntary. The stitches have held for 8 years. They'll hold for 8 more if they need to. She's learned patience in ways that most people never have to. She's learned to wait for the right moment. She's learned that rushing never ends the way you plan. Her phone buzzes once, a text from an unknown number containing only a single emoji, a shield. She reads it once, then deletes it entirely. She tucks her jacket back on, the patch disappearing once more into its hiding place against her ribs, and returns to the ICU at exactly 10:30, her timing perfect, her composure intact. What she doesn't know yet is that her world is about to contract and then explode outward in ways that will erase every careful boundary she's built over the past 4 years at St. Michael's. What she doesn't know is that Captain Rodriguez in room 4 isn't just another trauma patient. What she doesn't know is that Dr. Mercer is looking for a reason to remove her from the hospital before something happens that he's already been told might happen, and that he's been offered money to make sure it does. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Mercer glided through the intensive care unit like a man conducting an orchestra, only he could hear 6 medical students trailing behind him in careful formation. His shoes clicked against the tile with the rhythm of a metronome, and Megan kept her eyes on the vital signs monitor in front of her, her fingers steady on the keyboard despite what was about to happen. She had learned long ago that the best defense against humiliation was to appear already resigned to it. "Here we see what happens when nurses overstep their lane," Mercer announced, gesturing toward her station with theatrical disdain that made the air feel heavier. His voice carried across the entire ICU, deliberate and projecting, designed to reach every ear in the unit. Miss O'Brien documented a medication discrepancy yesterday that wasted pharmacists' time for 3 solid hours, all because she apparently can't read a chart correctly. The students shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Mercer and Megan like spectators at a match they hadn't volunteered to attend. One of them looked away entirely. Mercer's expression suggested he found their discomfort amusing. Megan's jaw tightened, a single invisible contraction of muscle that lasted less than a second, but her hands continued their rhythm on the keyboard. Vital signs flowing in. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation. Numbers that told stories to anyone trained to read them. Her typing didn't pause. Her breathing didn't change. To anyone watching, she had heard nothing at all, or heard it and found it beneath acknowledgement. This was the armor she had learned to wear in a different world, in a place where showing weakness meant your team bled out. What Mercer didn't know, what he had carefully arranged to not know, was that Megan had caught him in something far more deliberate than a charting error. She had documented a medication discrepancy on 4 cardiac patients over the past 6 weeks. The prescriptions read for brand-name anticoagulants, the most expensive formulations, billed directly to insurance at premium rates. But the medications actually dispensed were generics, manufactured by a phantom supplier that only Mercer seemed to have access to. The difference, $200 per patient per dose, moved through accounts that existed in the shadows between hospital administration and a private pharmacy with no physical address. She had seen the pattern in the billing codes first, then verified it by watching the medication cabinet logs and cross-referencing them with what actually went into patient 4's. 3 hours of work, meticulous and documented. What Mercer called time wasting, other people in other uniforms would have called evidence. Some people mistake stubbornness for diligence, he continued, his voice dropping into a confessional tone that made it sound like concern. He was good at this. He had practice. 2 of the students laughed on cue, 4 sounds that echoed off the ICU walls like they'd been pre-recorded and played back at slightly the wrong volume. Megan entered the next set of vitals into the system, room 3, a post-op cardiac bypass patient whose numbers were climbing steadily back toward normal. She did not look up. An hour later, at 11 o'clock, Megan stood in front of the vending machine in the staff lounge, feeding dollar bills into the slot with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. The machine hummed, a sound like a small engine laboring under load, and dropped a coffee cup into the dispenser. She had learned to appreciate small, deliberate actions. They grounded you. They kept your hands from shaking. The cup was warm against her palm. The door opened behind her. Mercer entered with 2 residents, both of them laughing at something he'd just said, both of them trailing him the way people trail powerful things. He positioned himself near the security guard stationed by the vending machine alcove, a routine placement, or so it would have looked to anyone not paying attention. But Megan had been trained to notice positioning. Escape routes. Witnesses. Mercer rested his hand on the security guard's shoulder with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to owning the space around him. "I'm beginning to wonder whether some people have the cognitive capacity for critical care," Mercer said loudly, his words directed at the vending machine but his eyes on the back of Megan's head. His voice had the quality of someone thinking aloud in a room full of people, the kind of observation that seemed innocent until you realized it was surgical. When you can't follow basic protocols, when you make things up as you go, maybe it's time to consider something more suited to your abilities. Simpler work. Housekeeping, perhaps. Dietary. Somewhere the damage you do is limited. One of the residents snickered. The other joined in, and the sound filled the small room like smoke. The security guard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Megan's hand wrapped around the coffee cup. Her knuckles didn't whiten. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She turned, a smooth, economical movement, and walked past the three of them without making eye contact with any of them, without acknowledging that they existed at all. She walked the way soldiers walk through hostile territory, present but not engaged, moving with the kind of controlled precision that suggested she had somewhere else to be and nothing could change that. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like fluorescent lights do in hospitals, that steady electrical drone that becomes the background to everything. She didn't slam the door. She didn't speak. She simply moved through the space and away from it, and behind her, Mercer's hand dropped from the security guard's shoulder. His smile didn't fade, but something in his eyes shifted, a recalibration of something he'd been calculating. It wasn't until later, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that Megan allowed herself the small fracture. The supply closet on the 3rd floor held suture kits, bandaging supplies, and the kind of quiet that only comes from rooms people pass quickly. She stood in front of the shelves counting, her voice a whisper, 12, 13, 14. The boxes were color-coded, organized with the precision of someone whose life had once depended on knowing exactly where everything was. 15, 16, 17. Her breath caught. Just once. 3 seconds. A single moment where the composure that had been built over years, over continents, over tours in places with names she couldn't say to civilians, where it threatened to fracture like glass under pressure. Her hand stopped moving. The boxes blurred slightly. She could taste copper at the back of her throat, the familiar taste of adrenaline with nowhere to go. Then she exhaled. A long, measured breath that came from the bottom of her diaphragm. Her hands resumed their movement. 18, 19, 20. The voice was steady again. Professional. The woman who had temporarily wavered was gone, and in her place was the nurse who had been trained not to break under any circumstance, because breaking got people killed. By 4:45 in the afternoon, Mercer had made 3 phone calls. The first had been to a hospital board member named Patricia Hendricks, where he discussed staffing concerns and the need for more rigorous credentialing verification in the ICU department. The second had been to the nursing school that had granted Megan her credentials 8 years ago, ostensibly to verify her employment history. The third had been to an outside investigator he kept on retainer, a woman named Dr. Sarah Vance who specialized in background checks and character assessments for institutions concerned about liability. At 6:45, when Megan was occupied at the medication dispensary pulling insulin cartridges for the evening rounds, Mercer retrieved her personnel file from the administrative office. His phone camera was steady in his hands as he photographed each page, the official nursing license, the hospital employment contract, the reference letters. What the file contained was a carefully constructed history, 8 years of nursing experience, 3 hospitals, 0 gaps, all of it legitimate and all of it covering a very different kind of service. The employment dates had been arranged years ago, before she took the position at St. Michael's. They had been perfect then. They still looked perfect. But Mercer wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for gaps. For something that didn't add up. For evidence that the quiet nurse with steady hands and eyes that seemed older than her face was something other than what she claimed to be. What he didn't know was that she already knew he was looking. And what he absolutely could not have anticipated was that in exactly 3 hours and 15 minutes, his search would become catastrophically irrelevant. The night stretched ahead like a held breath. Somewhere in the hospital, in a private room on the cardiac ward that Mercer had specifically requested be maintained as quiet as possible, a patient was settling in for what he assumed would be an uneventful recovery. Megan finished her shift at 10 o'clock, changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, and walked to her car with her hands in her pockets and her breathing perfectly level. The evening air of Raleigh smelled like rain coming, that electric smell of pressure building in the atmosphere. She drove home to an apartment with no photographs on the walls and no indication of the life she'd lived before this one. At 2:45 in the morning, her phone would buzz with a message, Captain Rodriguez, stable. Vitals holding. But something would be wrong with those vitals, a subtle shift that only someone trained in combat medicine would recognize immediately. And at that moment, everything Mercer had constructed, all his phone calls, all his photographs, all his careful positioning, would become dust. At 02 for 5 hours, the ICU settled into that particular silence that only night shift nurses understand, not quiet, but weighted, the kind that comes when machines outnumber people and every sound carries diagnostic significance. Megan moved through the darkened corridor with the economical grace of someone who had learned long ago that efficiency was its own form of invisibility. Room 4. She had passed it 17 times that evening without appearing to look directly at it, but her eyes registered everything: the rise and fall of the ventilator, the color of the drainage tube, the angle of Captain Rodriguez's head on the pillow. At 02 for 4, his oxygen saturation read 94% on the monitor. Acceptable. Normal for a man 3 days post-trauma with 2 fractured ribs and a pneumothorax that had already been partially resolved. She was checking the fall line when the number changed. 94 to 89 in the space of her next breath. Then 88. The descent was happening too fast, the kind of drop that meant something was shifting inside his chest cavity, air accumulating in the pleural space faster than his body could compensate. Megan's hand stilled on the 4 tubing. Her mind partitioned the information with the precision of someone trained to function in combat conditions where hesitation meant body bags, respiratory rate climbing, chest wall compliance decreasing, oxygen saturation falling like a stone. She could hear his breathing from 2 feet away now, or shallow, rapid, the sound of a man whose lungs were being compressed by pressure that shouldn't exist. She did not call for Dr. Mercer. She did not call for the on-duty resident. She did not follow the protocol that required physician authorization for procedures beyond her nursing scope. Instead, she moved to his bedside and tilted his head slightly to assess the tracheal deviation she could already feel coming, the subtle shift in the anatomy beneath the skin. There. Visible now in the shadows cast by the monitor glow. His trachea had deviated visibly to the left, a physical testament to the building pressure on his right side, to the tension pneumothorax that was collapsing his lung and would stop his heart if the pressure continued to build. Her hands were already moving. Alcohol wipe. The smell of it sharp and clean in the recycled air. She found the 3rd rib, ran her finger along it until she felt the inferior border, located the 4th intercostal space. Her fingers mapped the anatomy with the kind of certainty that came from having done this before in conditions considerably less sterile than an ICU, having done this to keep soldiers breathing when a surgical team was 30 miles away and the patient was bleeding out faster than fluids could replace the volume. The needle was 14 gauge, the kind that would allow the trapped air to escape. She angled it perpendicular to the chest wall, found the space between ribs with the precision of someone inserting a key into a lock in total darkness. The pressure release came immediately. The hiss of air escaping from the pleural cavity was unmistakable, a whisper of decompression that sounded like relief itself. Rodriguez's breathing changed in the same second. His chest expanded. His oxygen saturation climbed, 88 to 92 to 95. The numbers became visible evidence of his lungs re-inflating, the pressure inside his chest normalizing, his heart returning to a rhythm that would sustain consciousness. His eyes opened. He looked directly at her. No confusion, no fear, just the focused awareness of a man whose body understood it had been pulled back from the edge. "Captain," he said, the word barely audible but weighted with recognition that went beyond the moment. She did not respond. She documented nothing. She replaced the needle with a proper chest tube set up over the next 18 minutes, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her movements economical and exact. The bleeding had been minimal. The placement was textbook perfect. By 03:05, Rodriguez was breathing normally, his color returned to something that resembled human rather than corpse, his oxygen saturation hovering steady at 96%. The ventilator's rhythm had changed, his lungs were doing more of the work themselves now, the machine stepping back into its supporting role. She finished the documentation and moved to the next room without lingering. By morning, Captain Rodriguez was sitting up in bed, asking for her by name. His vital signs had stabilized overnight, blood pressure 128/74, heart rate 62 and regular, oxygen saturation 97% on minimal supplementation. The X-ray confirmed it, lungs clear, no reaccumulation of air, no signs of the tension pneumothorax that would have killed him inside of 8 minutes without intervention. The attending radiologist had noted the quality of the chest tube placement in his report. Professional work. The kind of work that required training. The kind of work that should have required a physician's hands. By 1400 hours, Megan was sitting in the administrator's office on the 4th floor with windows that overlooked the parking lot, and Dr. Mercer stood beside the hospital's chief of medicine like a prosecutor preparing his summation. His expression carried the weight of manufactured concern, the kind of gravity that men like him deployed when they were about to weaponize institutional power against people like her. The folder was open on the mahogany desk. She could see her name typed on the tab. Inside, she could see her own handwriting from the night shift notes. Miss O'Brien, the chief of medicine, began, uncomfortable in the way that authority figures became when they had to deliver someone else's judgment. This is a teaching hospital with protocols. We have standards of care, chains of command, liability concerns. Your cowboy medicine last night endangered a patient, Mercer said, and his voice carried the kind of certainty that came from knowing his network was already in motion, his calls already made, his positions already secured. Needle decompression without physician authorization. No witnessed consent. No documentation of failed conventional measures. No attempt to contact a resident before proceeding. He turned a page in the folder. We have a responsibility to our patients, Miss O'Brien. We cannot have nurses making decisions that belong to physicians, regardless of the outcome. Captain Rodriguez is alive and breathing normally, Megan said. Her voice was level. Her hands rested flat on her thighs, palms down, a posture that looked compliant but was actually a controlled release mechanism, the kind of stance that allowed a person to move from seated to vertical in approximately 1.2 seconds if the situation required it. Captain Rodriguez could have died from your recklessness, Mercer countered, leaning forward with the posture of a man who was accustomed to winning these conversations. We have chest tubes. We have residents. We have protocols that exist to ensure that patients receive care from qualified physicians, not nurses making judgment calls because they watched a YouTube video. He smiled slightly, the expression of someone savoring the moment when power became visible. We're placing you on administrative leave pending investigation. Full investigation. Your credentials, your background, your employment history, all of it needs to be reviewed. The chief of medicine looked genuinely uncomfortable. He opened his mouth as if to add something mitigating, then closed it again. Mercer had already spoken. Mercer controlled the narrative. Through the office window, Megan could see room from this angle. Rodriguez was sitting up, talking to a visitor, a Navy officer in dress whites, someone whose insignia marked him as a 3-stripe petty officer. The officer was laughing at something Rodriguez had said, his posture relaxed, his bearing the kind of easy confidence that came from serving with someone you respected. Rodriguez was gesturing toward the window, toward the hospital, toward the place where his life had been preserved at 02 for 5 hours by someone who understood that protocols were designed for normal emergencies, not for the kind of catastrophic failure that required action before permission could be requested. At 1,530 hours, security arrived at the nursing station. Not to remove her physically. Not to escort her from the building with the kind of dramatic finality that might look like retaliation. Just a quiet conversation with the charge nurse, a notation in the system, a temporary badge deactivation. The implication was there in the way they didn't touch her, the way they spoke to her with the excessive courtesy that masked institutional rejection. Mercer had activated his network precisely, board members who owed him favors from years of medication discrepancies that had mysteriously not been reported, an investigator who had already found concerns about her employment history gaps, hospital legal counsel who were nervous about liability and therefore willing to suspend judgment preemptively. Megan finished her paperwork. She clocked out at 16:58. She made one final round at 1700, checking Rodriguez's chart remotely from the nurse's station terminal. His condition was stable. His blood work showed no signs of infection. He was scheduled for transfer to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in 48 hours, the exact window when he was supposed to testify about the procurement fraud he had witnessed in Kandahar province in 2019, the reason Navy intelligence had placed her here as his protection in the first place, the real job underneath the scrubs and the badge and the carefully constructed facade of invisibility. At 18:30 hours, as she was preparing to leave the hospital, Megan noticed two men entering through the east entrance. They were not hospital staff. They were not patients' families. They were not deliverymen or maintenance personnel or any of the ordinary civilian categories that populated a hospital during the evening shift. Their movements were wrong, too coordinated, too aware of angles and sightlines, the kind of tactical precision that came from training similar to hers. Their positioning was triangulated. One covered the main entrance. One covered the stairwell. Neither was actually looking at anyone directly, but both were aware of every person in the corridor, every camera, every exit route. The man nearest to the ICU had his right hand positioned exactly where it would need to be to draw a weapon without impeding his movement. Pain is data. Her hands were already reaching for the emergency code button on the nurse's station before her conscious mind had fully articulated what her training recognized instantly: the tension pneumothorax had been a test. Rodriguez was still alive, which meant the real threat was just arriving, and the window for preventing what was about to happen was closing with the kind of urgency that left no room for administrative protocols or chain of command authorization or any of the normal structures that govern civilian hospital operations. Dr. Mercer's phone was already out when Megan arrived for her shift, the device angled toward the open personnel file spread across his desk like evidence. His fingers scrolled, capturing each image with deliberate precision, her employment history, the gaps between positions carefully documented, years that didn't align with any standard nursing trajectory. He didn't look up when she passed his office. He didn't need to. The trap was already set. By noon, he'd made 4 calls. 2 to board members whose names carried weight in hospital administration. 1 to the Dean of Nursing at Duke University where her credentials supposedly originated. The calls had been brief and surgical, concerns about credential verification, employment gaps that suggested falsified records, a pattern inconsistent with standard nursing progression. The dean had promised a callback. The board members had promised to look into it. Dr. Mercer had smiled like a predator who'd finally found a deer at the water's edge. At 1,400 hours, a hospital administrator with the bearing of someone delivering bad news escorted Megan to the 5th-floor conference room. An outside investigator sat across the table, his tablet glowing with what appeared to be her entire employment history spread across its screen. His name was Foster. His voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone trained to extract information without accusation. Miss O'Brien, we're attempting to verify your background as part of routine credentialing review. Can you explain the gaps in your employment history? You list nursing positions in Seattle, Denver, and San Diego, but there are periods, sometimes 6 to 8 months, where no employment is documented. Can you walk us through those gaps? Megan's hands remained perfectly still on the table. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a clinical white that made lies feel impossible, though that was never actually true. Lies were easiest in bright places where people expected truth. She could see Dr. Mercer standing outside the conference room window, his arms crossed, watching with the satisfaction of a man who'd finally managed to corner something dangerous into a space where administrative protocol mattered more than anything else. Those were periods of transition, Megan said. Her voice remained level, a nurse explaining a scheduling conflict. Personal matters. Family situations. Nothing related to my clinical competence. Foster made a note. Your current position lists you as a staff RN in critical care, but your educational background appears to include some military coursework. Advanced trauma medicine. Field medicine protocols. Why would a standard ICU nurse require that training? The question hung there like a scalpel, waiting. Megan had prepared for this the moment she'd accepted the assignment 6 months ago. Every cover story had backup. Every gap had a narrative. Every potential inconsistency had been catalogued and explained to her handler before she'd ever set foot in St. Michael's ICU. But she could see Dr. Mercer's face through the window, and she knew that none of her carefully constructed explanations were going to matter in the next hour. Something had changed. The calculus had shifted. Foster was still talking, asking about specific courses, specific dates, but Megan had already heard the real question underneath the words, "Who are you actually?" And the answer to that question wasn't something an outside investigator could extract from employment records or nursing school transcripts. At 18:30 hours, the ICU doors opened in a way that made every nurse in the unit look up simultaneously. Not the automated hiss of standard operating hours. Not the gentle swing of a doctor arriving for rounds. The doors opened with the kind of purpose that came from people who didn't ask permission. Two men in dark suits. Both carrying the particular bearing of people who'd been trained to move through spaces without apology. The taller one's hand was positioned against his torso in that specific way that meant concealed carry. The second man's eyes moved across the ICU with the systematic precision of someone conducting a threat assessment. Megan saw them before anyone else registered that something was wrong. She'd been sitting at the nurse's station completing Rodriguez's evening vitals, her mind running through the scenarios she'd been briefed on, the threat assessment protocols, the contingencies. The moment they entered, the exact moment their weight transferred from the threshold to the tile floor, everything crystallized. They weren't hospital staff. They weren't police. They weren't walking toward any of the standard bays. They were moving toward room 4. Toward Rodriguez. Toward the man whose testimony about a $47 million procurement fraud was worth more to certain people than his continued existence. The taller man's hand moved toward his jacket. Megan was already moving. Not running. Not calling out. Just moving with the kind of fluid precision that came from having already rehearsed this scenario in her mind 1,000 times across 6 months of cover identity. Her body crossed the 15 feet between the nurse's station and Rodriguez's bed in the time it took the first man's fingers to clear his jacket. She threw herself across Rodriguez's body, not gently, not with hesitation, with the full weight of someone trained to absorb impact. Her left shoulder struck the bed frame. Her right side hung over the edge of the mattress. She had 3 seconds before they fired. The first shot cracked through the ICU like a whip. The second followed half a second after. The rounds punched through the air where her head had been moments before and buried themselves in the wall behind the bed, leaving exit holes the size of quarters. Megan felt the third round enter her left shoulder with the kind of burning that was information, not pain. Not yet. The fourth struck her right abdomen, and that one she felt travel through tissue and muscle and all the anatomical structures that didn't care about adrenaline or training or the fact that she needed to stay conscious for the next 4 minutes. Rodriguez was screaming something. The heart monitor was shrieking its alarm. Her hands, the ones that had held lives together in Kandahar, that had performed field amputations by floodlight, that had kept bleeding soldiers conscious through the interminable wait for helicopter extraction, her hands found his chest tube site and maintained pressure. The dressing was still intact. The line wasn't displaced. The subclavian access was patent. Data. Pain is data. Her blood was mixing with his sheets, creating dark pools that spread across the white cotton like a Rorschach test of her own survival. She could feel the round in her abdomen hadn't exited. Could feel the way her left shoulder had that particular kind of wrong angle that meant either a through and through or a round still lodged in the deltoid muscle. Hospital security appeared somewhere beyond the foot of the bed. The 2 men in suits were already moving toward the service exit, and Megan processed that information with the clinical precision of someone whose brain was already beginning to disengage from the pain. They weren't trying to finish the job. They were extracting. That meant Rodriguez was going to stay alive. That meant the assignment had hold. That meant her job wasn't over even though her body was now operating on something other than blood volume. She stayed conscious through sheer will. When the trauma team arrived at 19:15, she was still pressed across Rodriguez's torso, her breathing controlled, her pressure steady on his chest tube despite the fact that her left arm was barely responsive and her right side was generating a pain signal that her nervous system seemed to be broadcasting in all caps. They loaded her onto a separate stretcher at 19:20 and wheeled her out of the ICU while Rodriguez was being prepped for emergency CT. Surgery consumed the next 3 hours. When Megan woke in recovery, her left arm was immobilized in a sling, her torso wrapped so tightly that breathing felt like negotiating with her own anatomy. The bandages already showed seepage, blood continuing to find its way through every layer of gauze and tape. The recovery room nurse was explaining something about transfusions and follow-up imaging, but Megan's ears were focused on the sounds beyond the curtain. The pulse oximetry from other beds. The ventilator hiss from someone 3 spaces down. The steady beeping of systems meant to keep broken people alive. At 2,200 hours, a hospital administrator entered with Dr. Mercer trailing behind him like a shadow that had finally learned to cast itself forward. The message was delivered with a kind of bureaucratic precision that removed all emotion from the act of destruction. Effective immediately, her employment was terminated. Violation of administrative leave pending investigation. Creation of a security incident on hospital grounds. Unauthorized patient contact during suspended status. Dr. Mercer's paperwork had been processed at 20:30 while she was still under anesthesia. He'd anticipated every move. She'd saved Rodriguez's life, and he'd fired her while she was unconscious. By 0800 the next morning, Megan sat in the empty nurse's lounge with her scrubs folded carefully in her lap. The fabric still held the faint rust-colored stains that wouldn't wash out, Rodriguez's blood mixed with her own, a reminder that some things don't separate even with proper detergent. She moved through each fold with methodical precision despite the radiating burn across her right side and the dead weight of her left arm. 6 months in this identity. 6 months of keeping her eyes down while Dr. Mercer paraded his contempt past her station. 6 months of being invisible to everyone except the one person who actually mattered, the captain in room for whose testimony was worth killing for. She placed the scrubs in the hospital laundry bin. Just navy scrubs. Unremarkable. Anonymous. Except they'd been the uniform of her disappearance. But that wasn't the worst part. And then the doors burst open. At 08 for 5, 3 black SUVs pulled directly to the hospital's main entrance and disgorged personnel in the kind of coordinated motion that suggested military discipline. A Marine Corps colonel entered first, his uniform immaculate, his bearing absolute. Behind him came a 2-star general and 4 armed personnel in tactical gear. They moved through the lobby without stopping to check in with administration. They didn't ask permission. They navigated directly to the 5th floor where Megan was preparing to leave through the service entrance, where Dr. Mercer was conferring with security about ensuring her immediate departure from the building. The general's eyes found her across 30 feet of hallway, and he rendered a full salute. Not casual. Full military salute, fist to chest, held for 3 seconds while every hospital staff member in the corridor froze in place. Dr. Mercer's face went white. He looked like someone who'd just realized the deer he was cornering was actually an apex predator that had been playing along the entire time. The nurse's lounge smelled like stale coffee and fluorescent decay, the kind of institutional air that clings to your scrubs after 12 hours of breathing it in. Megan sat in the corner, her left arm immobilized in a sling, white gauze visible beneath her hospital gown where the surgeons had packed the wound in her shoulder. The bandages across her torso were already showing rust-colored stains that hadn't washed out, blood that belonged to her now, mixed with the metallic smell of saline and sutures. Her discharge papers sat on the plastic chair beside her, signed an hour ago, terminated for gross negligence, unauthorized procedures, violation of hospital protocols. The words meant nothing. The numbness meant everything. 3 black SUVs pulled into the emergency bay at 08 for 7 hours. No sirens. No announcement. The nurses whispered, federal plates, tinted windows, men in suits moving with the coordinated precision of operators. Megan didn't look up. She'd seen enough men in suits to know what they meant. What she didn't know was that they were coming for her. The lounge door opened without a knock. A woman in a charcoal blazer entered first, followed by 2 men whose shoulders filled the frame. Captain O'Brien, the woman said. Not a question. Not a request. Megan's hands remained steady on her lap. I've been discharged. Not anymore. The woman extended credentials, Pentagon Security Affairs Division, Deputy Director Sarah Chen. We need to move you upstairs. There's an individual in Trauma Bay 3 requiring emergency surgery, and he's asked for your presence during his intake evaluation. Before Megan could respond, a commotion erupted from the hallway, security guards moving quickly, voices raised in controlled urgency. The woman nodded to one of the men, who disappeared into the corridor. Megan's jaw tightened. She knew that urgency. She'd felt it in operations where the objective changed in real time. They brought the prisoner through on a secured stretcher, a man Megan had last seen in a concrete cell in Kabul, his hands shackled to the transport frame, his eyes carrying the particular hatred of someone whose network had been dismantled by a woman he'd underestimated. His breathing hitched when he saw her face. His lips pulled back from his teeth in a snarl that had nothing to do with his injuries. The angel of the Hindu Kush, he spat, the words landing like bullets. You survived. The room froze. The medical staff exchanged glances. Deputy Director Chen's expression didn't shift, but her hand moved to her phone. The two federal agents stepped closer to the stretcher, their posture changing, not toward aggression, but toward protection. Toward her protection. Megan didn't move. Didn't flinch. She simply looked at the man on the stretcher with the flat, colorless gaze of someone cataloging data. Get him to imaging, she said to the trauma team, her voice dropping an octave from the frightened nurse they'd fired that morning. Abdominal ultrasound first. Then CT with contrast. Move. The surgical team moved without hesitation. Megan had spoken with the voice of authority, the kind of authority that doesn't come from a hospital ID badge. A Marine Corps colonel entered the lounge, tablet in hand, his uniform bearing the insignia of someone accustomed to commanding respect rather than asking for it. He was flanked by a two-star general whose presence seemed to compress the air in the small room. The colonel didn't smile. He never did. He simply opened his file and began reading with the tone of someone officially entering something into the historical record. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism while serving as the ranking military intelligence officer during Operation Mountain Forge. Captain Megan O'Brien coordinated the extraction of 73 personnel under sustained enemy fire, operating without backup for 18 hours, breaking the Kandahar network, and preventing an estimated 12,000 civilian casualties through precision intelligence operations. The colonel paused. Looked up from the tablet. That was 2014. You've been operating undercover status for the last 9 years. The general stepped forward, a two-star whose shoulders carried medals and history. He didn't speak. He simply raised his right hand and executed a perfect salute directly to Megan, his palm flat, his posture rigid, the kind of salute reserved for officers of equivalent rank or higher. When his hand dropped, the entire room understood. You don't salute a nurse. You salute a soldier. Captain O'Brien's cover assignment, Deputy Director Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of official government communication, was to provide close protection for Captain Rodriguez, the sole surviving witness to a procurement conspiracy that reaches into 5 Pentagon departments and 3 defense contractors. His testimony would have cost those individuals approximately $200 million in fraudulent contracts and exposed them to federal prosecution for conspiracy to commit murder. Dr. Mercer was paid $500,000 through shell accounts to ensure Rodriguez didn't leave this hospital alive. Megan's breathing remained steady. The numbness was lifting, replaced by a clarity that felt like stepping out of water. She'd known something was wrong, the precision of the attack, the timing, the setup. But she'd filed it away. Filed it down. Focused on what was in front of her, the patient. The protocol. The mission. The investigation was already collapsing somewhere above them, unfolding in real time like dominoes calibrated to fall. Hospital IT specialist Marcus Webb, a Marine Corps veteran who worked the graveyard shift and had learned to preserve evidence the way soldiers learn to preserve lives, had walked into the Federal Command Center at 0910 with a flash drive in his palm. Sir, Dr. Mercer attempted to delete security footage at 0300 this morning, Webb had reported, his voice steady with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. I preserved everything. The footage showed Mercer in the ICU corridor at 18:55 hours, his keycard opening the security doors, holding them open, speaking briefly with two men whose faces matched known associates of the Sinaloa cartel's pharmaceutical division. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Then Mercer retreated to his office while the two operatives waited in the stairwell. Further evidence unfurled like a confession written in binary code. Financial investigators found the Phantom Pharmacy supplier, a shell company registered to a Delaware holding account, receiving payments for brand-name anticoagulants never delivered, the money flowing to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Over 18 months, systematic billing fraud. Medication records deleted at precise intervals. The pattern was so clean it was almost artistic, the work of someone who'd done it before, many times, never caught. Board members who'd suddenly remembered urgent appointments when Mercer called began receiving visits from federal agents carrying warrants. The outside investigator hired to manufacture concerns about Megan's credentials provided a sworn statement. Dr. Mercer asked me to develop credibility issues. He provided talking points. He explicitly stated the objective was to isolate O'Brien from the patient prior to an undefined incident. At 1,100 hours, federal agents arrested Dr. Mercer in the parking lot as he attempted to leave with 2 boxes of financial records. He protested, threatened lawsuits, dropped names of powerful friends, board members, city council representatives, a state senator. None of his calls were returned. His network, constructed over years, collapsed in hours. Not because it was weak, but because power is meaningless when the Pentagon has decided you're expendable. The door to the lounge burst open, not with violence, but with the kind of controlled urgency that precedes major announcements. Mercer's face appeared first, his expression cycling through denial, then rage, then the slow-motion terror of someone watching their life compress into a single point of accountability. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to explain, to leverage some institutional favor he'd assumed was still in place. The general stepped forward, his presence enough to silence the room before Mercer's first word formed. It wasn't disrespect, it was simply the weight of someone carrying 3 silver stars and the authority to end careers with a phone call. Dr. Mercer, you're under federal arrest, Chen said, reading rights with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done this before. Conspiracy to commit murder. Healthcare fraud. Obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Mercer's face went white, then red, then a sickly grey that suggested his understanding was finally catching up to his circumstances. He'd played a game with rules he thought he understood. He'd underestimated every player at the table. And now, watching the federal agents move toward him with restraints, he was finally beginning to grasp the scope of his miscalculation. 6 months later, the sun broke across Camp Lejeune in bars of clean light that cut through the morning humid air like medical instruments, precise, unavoidable, clarifying. Megan stood in dress whites, her navy dress uniform crisp enough to draw blood, the shoulder that had taken 2 rounds now wrapped in scar tissue that would never fully fade. Beside her, Captain Rodriguez stood in his own dress uniform, fully healed, his body restored by surgeons whose skills matched her own competence. Behind them, 73 men and women in dress blue stood at attention, the extraction personnel, the soldiers, the intelligence officers she'd coordinated out of Mountain Forge 9 years ago. Her son James stood on the raised platform, receiving his promotion to lieutenant. When he turned to accept his new rank insignia from the commanding general, his first salute went to his mother. Not a formal military salute, a personal one, the kind that carries understanding. The crowd, family members, officers, enlisted personnel, fell silent. They didn't know yet. They would read about it in the official reports. But they recognized that salute. That was a son honoring his mother's sacrifice. That was a warrior recognizing another warrior. Rodriguez leaned close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I read it in your file. The letter you wrote before his deployment. You told him true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Rodriguez paused. You were right. And the world needs to know it. Megan's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only emotion she allowed to surface. Some missions nobody sees, she said quietly. That doesn't make them matter less. Across the country in Raleigh, Dr. Mercer loaded boxes into the side of a white medical supply van at the federal prison facility in Butner, North Carolina, 8 years into a sentence for conspiracy to commit murder and healthcare fraud. His medical license remained permanently revoked. His name had become a case study in hospital ethics courses, a warning about institutional power used without restraint. The corrections officers assigned to supervise him never looked at his face. Nobody did anymore. The Pentagon had established the O'Brien Protocol for undercover protection assignments, soldiers embedded as civilian staff, their presence invisible until the moment it became essential. Hospital security systems were rebuilt under Marcus Webb's direction, the ex-Marine who'd preserved evidence when it mattered most, who understood that some people wear uniforms and some people wear scrubs, and the bravest ones don't advertise which category they belong to. The promotion ceremony concluded with the 73 standing at attention, their hands rising in unison to salute the woman who'd kept them alive when staying alive seemed impossible. The cameras flashed. The families celebrated. And Megan O'Brien, the quiet nurse who'd kept her eyes down, whose hands had never trembled, whose legend had finally come home, simply stood at attention and accepted the recognition that had been waiting for her all along. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had your skills doubted, your value dismissed, your strength invisible to everyone watching, you understand why this story matters. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength breaking through institutional corruption. Like this video if you believe true heroism isn't always visible. And comment, have you ever judged someone only to discover you were completely wrong about who they were?